The town of Nara was wrapped in a kind of quiet that could make a man forget the sound of his own name. Mornings arrived not with noise, but with the sigh of wind brushing through bamboo, and evenings slipped away beneath the hum of distant temple bells. It was a place where time did not rush, and yet somehow everything slowly faded. Hiroto lived there, in a narrow wooden house at the edge of the town, beside a stream that whispered over stones. He was a craftsman by trade, a maker of clocks, though few of his clocks ever left his shelves. His workshop smelled of cedar and oil, filled with tiny cogs and rusted springs, each one waiting for attention that never came. He moved through the same rituals every day: heat water for tea, sweep sawdust from the floor, tinker half-heartedly with a gear until dusk. It wasn't unhappiness that surrounded him, but a quiet kind of emptiness that wore the same face as comfort. For years, Hiroto had mistaken routine for purpose. People often do. They confuse motion with direction, the taking of hours with the movement of life. He believed his days were steady because they never changed. But steadiness without growth is simply stillness disguised as order. One winter evening, while the mountains disappeared under falling snow, Hiroto sat in his workshop staring at a half-finished clock. Its hands were frozen at 12. He felt, for the first time in years, that the clock and he were one. Mechanisms built to measure life but unable to move forward. He reached into a drawer to find a new gear, and instead discovered a small, folded note, yellowed with age. The handwriting was firm, written in strokes that had once guided his childhood. Great change begins with one small motion. It was from his father, who had passed away long ago. He remembered the man's hands, steady, deliberate, never hurried, yet always moving towards something unseen. He placed the note on his work table and stared at it for a long time. The candle beside him burned lower, its flame shrinking but steady. The words echoed in his mind like distant temple drums. He realized that his life had become like the candle, burning, yes, but without light enough to see where he was going. He sat back and closed his eyes. The idea of great change frightened him. People talk about transformation as though it is sudden, like lightning splitting the sky. But Hiroto sensed that what the note whispered was different. One small motion. He repeated the phrase aloud, testing its weight. It felt honest, like a promise even an exhausted man could keep. When dawn arrived, a pale mist hung over the stream. Hiroto stepped outside, still holding his father's note. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible, and for a moment he watched it drift and disappear, a small reminder that even something invisible could still exist. He looked up at the mountains glowing faintly pink in the sunrise, and something stirred inside him, a pulse of quiet and tension. That morning, he decided he would change one thing. Not everything, not at once, just one. He cleaned the cracked window of his workshop, letting the light spill in. It wasn't much, but the room seemed larger somehow, as if the world had been waiting just beyond the dust. He brewed his tea differently, paying attention to the sound of the water, the scent of the leaves. For the first time, he tasted the moment rather than rushing past it. When he sipped it, he smiled. The tea hadn't changed, he had. That night, he wrote in his notebook a habit he hadn't touched in years. Today, I began with light. He didn't yet know it, but this was the birth of Kaizen in his life, the art of small improvements that compound like falling snow. And within that first act of awareness hid the seed of Shoshin, the beginner's mind that asks nothing from the world except to see it as new. Outside, the temple bells sounded again, slow and patient. The town remained silent, but something within Hiroto began to move, not in leaps or bounds, but in gentle ripples that promised transformation. It wasn't greatness he saw anymore. It was motion, steady, humble, alive. And so the man who had been quietly fading into the background of his own days began to walk again, not toward a destination, but toward a direction. The next morning, Hiroto rose before the sun. The world outside still slept, wrapped in silver fog, but he felt a soft pull inside his chest, as if the air itself was calling him to begin. For years, he had woken at the same hour, moving through the same motions, boiling tea, opening the shutters, waiting for the day to decide what it wanted from him. But today, he decided differently. He stepped outside barefoot, the chill of the ground grounding him to the earth. For the first time in many seasons, he watched the sky change color. The horizon bled from gray to rose, from rose to gold. The slow reveal of light was not dramatic, it was humble, patient, like a craftsman revealing a masterpiece one layer at a time. He thought about how the sun never rushes its rise, and yet it never fails to appear. He stood there for a long while, the warmth touching his face. He whispered softly, almost embarrassed by the sound of his own voice, "One step." It was not a declaration, but a promise. When he returned to his workshop, the air smelled different, or perhaps he had changed enough to notice it. He lit a single candle and looked around at the familiar disorder. Tools scattered, shelves layered with dust, clocks halted mid-tick. Everything seemed to reflect the stasis he had carried within. He decided he would not clean it all. That would only repeat the old habit of chasing perfection and giving up halfway. Instead, he focused on one act. He chose a single tool, an old carving knife with a dulled edge, and began to sharpen it. The rhythmic scrape of steel against stone filled the silence. It was not loud, but it was alive. Each motion felt like a breath, a deliberate inhalation and exhalation of attention. The blade grew brighter, and with it his mind. The edge caught a shard of light and he smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he had finished something small and complete. He did not tell anyone. He simply placed the knife back on the table, blade facing the morning light. The next day, he added another act. He cleaned one corner of his shop, carefully brushing the dust from each gear. It was tedious, but the rhythm became meditative. His movements found a natural pace, slow but sure, without the heaviness of effort. Kaizen, he realized, was not about improvement in the world outside. It was a conversation with the self, carried out through motion. Days passed and his workshop began to transform, not through renovation, but through attention. Every corner that he cleaned revealed another memory, another forgotten piece of care. The more he moved, the quieter his thoughts became. He no longer asked, "How long will it take?" Instead, he began to ask, "What can I do today?" Each act was a seed, and though he could not yet see what it would grow into, he trusted the soil of his own persistence. Sometimes he faltered. Some mornings the bed held him too tightly, whispering that small steps were meaningless. On those days, he would sit with his tea and watch the steam curl upward. The steam rose slowly, then vanished, reminding him that even the most fleeting acts had their beauty. One afternoon, while cleaning, he noticed a spider weaving a web in the corner of his window. It moved with effortless precision, thread by thread, spinning something delicate and strong. The creature worked without hurry, without doubt. He realized that life, in all its quiet intelligence, was built on repetition, small acts layered until they became art. By the seventh day, the light in his workshop looked different. It wasn't that the sun had changed. It was that the glass was finally clean enough for it to enter. He stood by the window, breathing in the scent of cedar and newness, and wrote in his notebook, "Today, I sharpened what was dull and found that it was me." Kaizen was beginning to teach him that the smallest step, repeated with heart, could rebuild a life. But there was another lesson stirring beneath it, subtle and childlike. Shoshin, the beginner's mind. Every day felt unfamiliar now, and strangely, that gave him peace. The world had not changed. He had simply begun to see it again. That night, he placed his father's note above the work table. The ink had faded, but its meaning had grown brighter. Great change begins with one small motion. He closed his eyes, feeling the hum of life returning to him. The clocks around him were still silent, but for the first time, he felt time moving, not as hours passing, but as a presence expanding within him. He smiled faintly, whispering into the quiet, 1% better than yesterday. And somewhere in the stillness of that workshop, a clock began to tick again.
Hiroto began to notice a different sound in the workshop, a sound so gentle it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. It was not the clatter of tools or the creak of the floorboards. It was the soft, steady rhythm of small changes adding themselves together. He named it the Whisper of Kaizen, though the word lived mostly in the tender way he now attended to each moment. At first, the changes were nearly invisible. A nick removed from a chisel here, a healed splinter there, the careful realignment of a gear that had for years refused to sit straight. Each act seemed too small to matter. Yet as days threaded into weeks, the accumulated effect began to shape the space. Shelves that had once sagged under neglect stood straighter. Clocks that averaged silence began to breathe. The light that entered through the window no longer stumbled over grime. It traveled freely and touched each surface with intention. People in the town noticed this but could not name it. A neighbor who came to trade rice remarked that Hiroto's hands moved with a curious certainty. A child peering through the doorway whispered that the place felt different, kinder somehow. These observations were not praise, merely small acknowledgments, like pebbles cast into a slow, widening pool. The ripples reached farther than anyone expected. Hiroto had not set out to impress. He had only promised himself one small motion each day. That promise changed the tenor of his life. He learned to measure success in the quiet language of attention. A moment once wasted on worry was now spent on a careful stroke. A morning once scrolled away in idle breath became the scene of a single deliberate act. The measure of a day no longer sat in accomplishments tallied at dusk. It sat in the sum of minute choices made with awareness. The discipline of repetition taught him an intimate truth. Improvement need not arrive as a thunderclap. It can be patient as rain, persistent as roots. One small motion, repeated faithfully, altered not only objects, but felt itself into habits, which in turn sculpted identity. His hands, worn and knotted like old root wood, remembered new ways. The motions that had been mechanical regained meaning. In the same motion by which he repaired a hinge, he repaired the part of himself that had surrendered to ease. Alongside Kaizen, Shoshin moved like light through the practice. The beginner's mind softened the edge of routine. Instead of moving through tasks with the stale confidence of someone who assumes mastery, he tried the work as if it were unknown, as if the next action might reveal something new. This stance kept curiosity alive. The humdrum became a field for discovery. A bowl he had mended 20 times greeted him every morning as if it were the first time he considered its curve. He learned to ask simple questions. Why does the wood hold this pattern? What would happen if the joint bore another way? These questions made each small act feel fresh. There were moments of friction. Old habits whispered that smallness was cowardice. that only grand gestures earned respect. Sometimes he fell into the old cadence of impatience, scanning the shop for a single leap forward. Those were the days when his heart felt heavy and the tools resisted. What saved him was not a sudden clarity, but the return to the promise, one small motion. He would choose the simplest task available, tightening a screw, smoothing a board, and in completing it, he would find his center again. The tiny completion rekindled momentum. His approach had a curious ripple into his evenings. Whereas before he might have resigned himself to the sameness of life, now he lingered to notice things. He watched the way the kettle sang at the brink of boiling. He noticed the way a moonbeam rested on the lip of a cup. These were not distractions. They were the subtle rewards of a life lived in smaller, more truthful increments. Each small observation became a thread connecting his days into a coherent tapestry. The apprentice who had come and gone was not the only witness. An old friend visited one afternoon and saw, for the first time, that Hiroto's hands moved with tenderness. The friend asked, with the casual curiosity of someone who had not listened long, "Why so patient?" Hiroto answered simply, "Because I am learning." The words were not meant to instruct, but to declare a way of being. Learning in that moment was not an achievement to be completed. It was an orientation one returned to every day. In the quiet hours, Hiroto began to map his life differently. He found that the accumulation of tiny acts created a landscape where larger shifts could occur naturally. The mountain of his former stasis had not been toppled by force. It had been eroded, grain by grain, until slopes formed and a new path revealed itself. This slow work felt almost sacramental. It honored the patience of things and the humility of hands. Neighbors began to mirror him in small ways without knowing why. A woman down the lane began to water her windowsill plants each morning with care. A carpenter across the square sharpened his plane before the day began. These were not conversions. They were subtle echoes. The town learning a language of attention through the visible example of a man who only ever kept one small promise. The whisper of Kaizen was not loud enough to command. It was only persistent enough to be remembered. In time, Hiroto discovered a softer courage within himself. He no longer feared the future or despised the past. He walked through days as if moving through a low fog, his feet finding purchase because each step had been practiced. The work taught him that identity could be rewritten not by grand vows, but by patient rehearsals of tiny truth. When the sun finally warmed the timber of his bench each afternoon, Hiroto would sit and touch the smooth edge of a tool. He felt the weight of the work that he had done, and a quiet gratitude for the smallness that had led him here. In that softened stillness, he understood that a life changed by 1% every day was not a life of sudden glory. It was a life of steady becoming, shaped by whispers, by patient hands, and by the beginner's mind that never stopped asking, "What might this next minute teach me?"
Seasons slipped by almost unnoticed. The plum trees bloomed, scattered their petals, and bloomed again. The stream near Hiroto's house thickened with moss and then ran clear after summer rains. Time still moved slowly in the town, but inside his small workshop, it had taken on a different texture. The silence was no longer heavy. It was alive. It carried the sound of intent. One morning, while adjusting the balance wheel of a small clock, Hiroto felt a knock at his door. A young apprentice stood outside, thin, curious, restless in the way youth always is.
The boy bowed politely and asked if he might learn the craft. Hiroto nodded, not with the enthusiasm of someone seeking help, but with the calm acceptance of one who sees a mirror arriving at his door. The boy's name was Sora. His questions came quickly, his movements faster still. He wanted to master everything before he understood anything. On the first day, he spilled oil, misaligned a spring, cracked a glass cover. Each time, he apologized and reached again for the next piece. Hiroto watched quietly, saying little. On the third day, Sora asked in frustration, "Why do you not teach me more quickly?" Hiroto replied, "Because you are learning too fast to see." The boy frowned, not understanding. Hiroto handed him a tiny screw, so small it could barely be held between the fingers. "Tighten this," he said. The boy twisted eagerly, and the screw snapped in two. Hiroto smiled faintly and said, "You see, speed blinds even the smallest truth." In the days that followed, Hiroto taught differently. He spoke less. He showed Sora how to listen, not just to him, but to the sound of the tools, the resistance of wood, the whisper of metal being shaped. "Every material," he said softly, "is trying to tell you what it wants to become. You only need to listen slowly enough." It was through teaching that Hiroto rediscovered Shoshin, the beginner's mind he had once lost without knowing. Watching Sora struggle, he remembered his own impatience, his old arrogance disguised as efficiency. He began to see that learning was not a straight road, but a circle. Every master eventually returns to the beginning. Each morning now carried the quiet excitement of rediscovery. The clock that he had repaired 100 times before revealed something new in its rhythm. The wood grain on his bench shimmered differently under changing light. He noticed things he had never bothered to before, the way steam curved upward from the kettle, how sawdust settled in slow spirals. It was as if life had been waiting for him to look properly. Shoshin had not entered his life as a concept. It arrived as humility. The boy often grew impatient. "Master," Sora would sigh, "how long until I can work like you?" Hiroto would answer, "As long as it takes for you to see the dust and call it beautiful." The boy laughed the first few times, thinking it was a riddle. Later, he stopped laughing. Weeks passed, and Hiroto noticed subtle shifts. The boy began to breathe slower while working, to pause between strokes. The mistakes still came, but they carried less frustration, and Hiroto, watching, found himself learning again, not how to craft clocks, but how to see the world through unpolished eyes. He realized that Shoshin was not only a student's virtue, it was the teacher's salvation. The mind that believes it already knows stops living. The one that remains curious, questioning, childlike, that mind never grows old. Hiroto's old doubts began to fade. The workshop no longer felt like a place of labor. It had become a temple of wonder. Every gear was a world, every turn of the screw a prayer. The rhythm of Kaizen and the innocence of Shoshin began to weave together. Small improvements became joyful discoveries. Repetition became reverence. One evening, after the day's work, Sora stayed behind to clean. Hiroto watched quietly as the boy arranged tools in perfect alignment. There was a carefulness to his motion, a quiet gratitude in the way his hands moved. When he was done, he bowed to the table before leaving. Hiroto smiled. The lesson had taken root. Later, as he sat alone by the window, he opened his journal and wrote, "When the student learns to see, the teacher remembers how to feel." Outside, the sky deepened into violet. The town slept, but Hiroto's eyes remained open to everything. The flicker of the candle, the distant cry of a crane, the steady heartbeat of his own breath. He realized then that improvement and curiosity were not separate roads. They were twin paths spiraling around the same truth. To change the self is to return to the beginning, again and again. That night, he dreamed of his younger self, the one who once believed growth required speed. In the dream, the younger Hiroto watched the older him at work, calm, patient, radiant in simplicity. When he woke, the morning light rested gently on the floorboards, the same as it always had, and yet he felt something entirely new. For the first time, he didn't rush to start the day. He simply sat there, breathing in the beauty of ordinary things. Shoshin had brought him home to a truth he had long forgotten. The world is not waiting to be mastered. It is waiting to be noticed.
Hiroto began to carry a small notebook in his apron pocket, a thin thing bound in faded cloth that his father might once have used. At first, the pages were empty because his days felt too ordinary to record. Yet, on an afternoon when rain softened the edges of the world, he uncapped his brush and wrote a single line, "Today I improved this." It was not a boast, it was a witness. That simple sentence found company. The next morning, he wrote another, "Today I boiled tea without bitterness." The line felt almost absurd in its simplicity, but writing it gave the act a shape and a memory. The pages accumulated small confessions and quiet triumphs. The screw tightened without striping, the joint fitted after a second try. The hour hand balanced just so. None of these events would attract a crowd or earn a medal. They were invisible to the busy eye, yet page by page, they began to outline a life that wanted living. There is a strange alchemy in small wins. They are not dramatic enough to change a biography in a sentence, but they are precise enough to alter the daily grammar of being. When a man registers that he completed something once, the brain receives a tiny proof that he can do it again. This is not vanity. It is the silent architecture of confidence. Each small success was a brick laid not to reach a throne, but to make a floor one could stand upon. Hiroto discovered the slow geometry of his days folding into a steadier shape. Neighbors noticed changes that were not meant for them. An old woman who sold tea remarked that Hiroto's walk looked less burdened. A boy who came for a broken toy left with the broadest smile because the toy ticked again and because the craftsman who fixed it had smiled as he handed it back. People began to stop at the shop not out of necessity, but out of the quiet magnetism that comes from someone who is present. They could not name the cause, they only felt the effect. Hiroto's journal became a map of small territories won. Sometimes the victories were practical, a drawer that opened without sticking, a clock that kept time across a full day. Sometimes they were softer, the patience to listen to a friend who had no one else, the calm to accept that rain would wash out plans without ruining the day. He wrote them not as evidence to show others, but as a liturgy to himself, The ritual of recording was itself a Kaizen practice. The act of naming what was improved carried improvement forward, like calling a boat by its name before it is launched. Yet victory is not always jubilant. Often it arrives wrapped in the plainness of ordinary work. Victory in small things requires a type of humility that most culture mistakes for insignificance. It is easier to chase spectacle than to tighten a screw twice because the first pass was sloppy. It is simpler to imagine a single heroic night rather than a 10-year slow polishing, but humility taught Hiroto endurance, and endurance taught him joy. Once, after an entire morning spent adjusting a single pendulum to swing true, he stepped back and felt his chest open, as if someone had unlatched a window inside him. A quiet joy settled, the kind that does not demand applause. There were days when the notebook remained blank. These were not failures, but weather. Sometimes fatigue settled like a gray shawl and nothing of consequence seemed possible. On those mornings, he learned another small victory, to stop judging the day for being small. He would set a micro task, wipe the same corner, refold a single cloth, brew tea, and let it sit for a reflective minute. Completing these tiny edicts restored dignity. In time, even the days of stillness stitched themselves into the story of progress. Sora watched this season with the wide eyes of someone learning the grammar of life. The student began to keep his own pages, copying the habit perhaps out of admiration or perhaps out of the contagious effect of a practiced life. When Sora showed a page with 2 lines, "Today I listened without interrupting. Today I did not rush the carving," Hiroto felt an old, gentle pride that had nothing to do with being praised. It was the pride of a hand that has helped another find its way. Within months, the workshop held a different light. Tools were not merely instruments, but companions. Their edges shone because they were used with care. The wooden benches bore the soft scars of work that had been returned to daily. Even the clocks, once stubborn and mute, whispered again in staggered chorus. The rhythm of the place had shifted from mere motion to a music of intention. Hiroto began to sense that identity itself was less a fixed statue and more a living thing, assembled over time from small choices. Each written line in his notebook acted like a stitch, knitting together a self that was practiced rather than proclaimed. Kaizen and Shoshin, in their quiet partnership, taught him 2 complementary arts: to improve and to remain open to improvement. The beginner's mind kept the practice alive. The steady practice gave the beginner room to return. When the season turned and cold light returned to the streets, Hiroto closed his journal and read the pages slowly, like a man reading a letter from an old friend. He did not see transformation as a sudden unveiling. He saw it as an accrual of the ordinary. He folded the book and placed it back in his pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of small victories against his hip. The world outside kept its grand rhythms, but inside that small chest of wood and paper, the cadence of a life reborn beat steadily, one quiet triumph at a time.
There came a time when the rhythm faltered. It happened, as such things always do, without announcement. One morning, Hiroto woke before dawn and could not remember why he had chosen to wake early at all. The familiar pull of purpose felt thin, like a thread stretched too far. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that has no cause except the slow weight of repetition. He sat by the window with his tea, watching steam rise and vanish,
and wondered if all his small motions had truly meant anything. His shelves were neater, his hands steadier, his clocks alive again. But what of himself? Did one truly change or only rearrange the same thoughts in prettier order? He stared at the mountain through the fog and felt smaller than ever. That day, when he tried to work, the tools refused to speak to him. The gears slipped, the brushes frayed, the timepieces misbehaved. He pressed harder, as if effort could coax meaning back into being, but nothing fit. Frustration tightened his chest. He remembered a version of himself who had worked like this before, with pride, with hurry, with the hunger for perfection, and how that life had hollowed him out. The memory frightened him. At midday, he walked to the stream behind his house. The water, cold and indifferent, moved around the stones without pause. He watched the current and realized that the stream did not question its motion. It did not demand that its flow be measured or applauded. It only moved because that is what water must do. Perhaps growth, too, was meant to be like this, an act of nature, not ambition. He picked up a smooth pebble from the riverbed, rolling it between his fingers. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and yet in its shape there was the patience of centuries. Water had shaped it grain by grain, never in haste. The lesson settled quietly into his bones. Returning to his workshop, he set the pebble on the table beside his journal. He looked around at the clutter he had thought defeated and smiled faintly. The dust had returned, as dust always does. The perfection he once imagined was, and would always be, temporary. Perhaps that was the point. He sat at his bench and began to clean a gear. Just one, the smallest he could find. The act did not bring immediate satisfaction. It felt almost trivial. But as he turned the brush slowly, watching the light catch in the grooves, something in him began to loosen. He realized up a measure of a day was not the visible result, but the quiet honesty of doing one's part. In the evening, Sora noticed the dullness in his teacher's eyes and asked gently, "Master, have you grown tired of the work?" Hiroto paused. "Not tired," he said after a moment, "just uncertain." Sora thought for a while before replying, "When I was younger, I once planted a tree. I watered it every morning for months, but nothing happened. I nearly gave up. Then one day, I saw a single leaf, so small I almost missed it. I think most of the growing happened where I couldn't see." Hiroto looked at the boy with quiet astonishment. The words felt like a bell struck softly in the heart. After Sora left, he wrote in his notebook, "Doubt is the shadow of progress. It appears only when light begins to return." The following days were slow. He did not chase enthusiasm, he simply kept showing up. There is a kind of faith that has no language, faith in the repetition itself, in the discipline of motion even when meaning seems far away. Kaizen, he began to understand, was not about feeling better every day. It was about continuing to move when you didn't. Sometimes, as he worked in silence, he imagined the mountains outside still growing, their rise so slow that no living eye could measure it. Perhaps change in the heart worked in the same hidden scale. The proof might never be visible, but that did not make it false. One evening, after another long day of quiet struggle, he looked at the pebble on his desk. Its dull surface gleamed faintly in candlelight. He realized that its beauty came not from polish, but from endurance. The water had failed 1,000,000 times to change it, and yet, through failure, had succeeded. He touched the pebble and whispered, "So will I." That night, before he slept, he wrote in his notebook again, "The smallest act done in doubt is still an act of faith." Over the next few weeks, the heaviness began to soften. He no longer expected every day to feel meaningful, Some were gray and quiet, some frustrating, some peaceful. But together they formed a texture, a life not free from struggle, but rich with continuity. The clocks ticked, steady and imperfect. The sun rose, not brighter, but enough. And Hiroto, once again, found the rhythm of a man who no longer needed proof to continue. He had learned that improvement is not a staircase that ascends smoothly upward. It is a spiral circling through effort, doubt, renewal, and quiet return. Every circle deepens the self. When he looked at his father's note again, he understood its wisdom differently now. Great change begins with one small motion was not a promise of perfection. It was a reminder that even a trembling hand moving gently forward honors life more than stillness ever could. And so, he arose the next morning with no expectation except to try again. The sun broke through thin clouds, ordinary and magnificent all at once. He smiled and the whisper returned. Kaizen had never left him. It had only grown quieter, waiting for him to listen again.
Years gathered quietly around Hiroto's life like rings around an ancient tree. The once restless apprentice, Sora, had grown into a steady young craftsman. His movements now carried the calm rhythm of understanding, the sort of grace that comes not from talent, but from time. Together they worked in silence most days. Their communication had become more gesture than word. An exchanged glance, a nod, a pause at the same sound of ticking. It was a conversation between two people who no longer needed to prove anything to each other. The shop had become less a place of work and more a shared meditation. One evening in late spring, the air thick with the smell of rain, Sora stayed after closing. He watched his teacher finish restoring an old pendulum clock. Hiroto's hands moved slower now, age tracing faint tremors across his fingers. But those tremors carried a deeper precision, the wisdom of restraint. He never forced the parts to fit. He coaxed them into harmony. When the final screw was set, the clock began to tick softly. Sora listened, realizing that the sound filled more than the room. It filled a space inside him that had once been noise. "Master," he said finally, "I think I understand your secret." Hiroto looked up, his eyes warm and unreadable. "Tell me," he said. "You don't try to change the world," Sora said quietly. "You change the day." Hiroto smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of years. "And the day," he replied, "changes the world." They sat together in the hum of the ticking clocks. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows in rhythmic agreement. Sora spoke again, his voice hesitant. "Do you ever wish you had done more? Built something grander? Your work is beautiful, but so small. Sometimes I wonder if small things are enough." Hiroto took a long breath before answering. "Once I believed only great deeds mattered. I tried to shape my life like a mountain. But mountains do not move, Sora. Rivers do. And rivers are made of many small drops." The apprentice thought about this, his gaze following the pendulum's arc. "Then what is Kaizen, truly?" he asked. Hiroto turned the question over like a pebble in his palm. "It's the art of loving motion," he said at last. "Not motion towards something, but motion itself. When you improve one small thing each day, you are really practicing gratitude for being alive enough to act." They fell silent again. The shop smelled of wood and oil and rain-soaked air. Sora reached for a rag and began to clean the table, moving with careful ease. He noticed how each stroke of his hand felt like a bow, a quiet thanks for all the lessons that required no words. After Sora left, Hiroto walked to the door and watched the young man vanish into the dusk.
The puddles on the street shimmered with reflections of lantern light, broken and reformed with each ripple. He stood there for a long while, thinking of how his father had once passed a single sentence to him. Great change begins with one small motion. Now, decades later, he had passed the same sentence to another soul, though wrapped in different words. The thought brought a faint ache to his chest, the kind of ache that feels less like sorrow and more like completion. He turned back inside, the sound of the rain mixing with the ticking of clocks. His hands found the familiar rhythm of tidying, the repetition that always grounded him. As he worked, he remembered the day the boy had arrived, clumsy, impatient, full of questions. He remembered his own frustration then, his doubt, and how teaching had quietly retaught him the meaning of being a beginner. Sora had been his mirror. Through the boy's mistakes, Hiroto had seen his own stubbornness soften. Through the boy's eagerness, he had rediscovered wonder. The apprentice had not only learned from him, he had returned something. An echo of innocence, the scent of first beginnings. It struck him then that Shoshin, the beginner's mind, was not a state one achieves and leaves behind. It was something one continually receives from others. Every time you teach, every time you love, every time you listen without the armor of certainty. He opened his journal and wrote, "When the teacher gives, he receives twice, once in the act of offering, and again in the reflection it awakens." Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the mountains. Hiroto blew out the candle, letting the darkness reclaim the room. The ticking continued, steady and alive. He sat there, listening, feeling both the weight and lightness of his years. He realized that even when his hands could no longer carve or wind the clocks, his work would live on, not in the wood or metal, but in the rhythm that another person had learned to carry. For all his years of improvement, this was the quiet truth Kaizen had been guiding him toward. Progress is not a ladder to climb alone. It is a rhythm to be shared, like music passed from one musician to the next. And as the rain whispered against the window and the clocks spoke their soft agreement, Hiroto closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in peace. Tomorrow, there would be another sunrise, another small motion. Perhaps his hands would tremble more, perhaps his pace would slow, but he would still begin again. Because even in endings, there is always one more beginning, waiting to be lived.
Years turned as quietly as pages in an old book. The boy had grown into a man, and Hiroto into an elder whose hair had surrendered entirely to white. His movements were slower now, but in them lived a certain grace, the deliberate rhythm of someone who no longer sought to win against time, but to walk beside it. His shop, once cluttered with unfinished work, had become a sanctuary of order and patience. Every surface carried the memory of touch. The wood along the counter had deepened in color from years of palms resting there. The tools, each one sharpened and polished countless times, shone with the soft brilliance of devotion. Even the air seemed alive with the quiet pulse of continuity. On a spring morning, as light filtered through the clean windows, Hiroto entered his workshop and paused. The clocks were ticking in unison, their overlapping beats forming a strange, delicate music. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him. This was not the sound of machines. It was the heartbeat of a lifetime. The apprentice, now a craftsman in his own right, arrived soon after, bowing as he entered. He carried himself with humility, his eyes carrying both youth and depth. Hiroto studied him with quiet pride.
What had begun as a teacher's duty had transformed into something beyond instruction. They had become reflections of one another, one beginning his journey, the other circling back to where all beginnings end. They worked side by side until the light softened into gold. At one point, the younger man looked at Hirado and asked gently, "Master, do you ever wish for more time?" Hirado smiled. "No," he said. "Time has already given me itself." He gestured toward the clocks around them. Each one of these measures the same hours, but not one of them ticks in the same way. The hands move at the same pace, yet every clock tells a different story. Time is not something we run through, it's something we shape. As evening descended, the younger craftsman began to wind the clocks for the night. Hirado remained seated, watching the play of light on the walls. The ticking grew softer, blending into the hum of twilight. He realized how often he had tried to chase life forward, faster, better, more perfect. But now, sitting there, he saw how every step, every hesitation, every failure had been necessary. Progress had not been a straight road at all. It had been a circle, carrying him home to the same quiet wonder that had first called him to begin. He remembered his father's note, now worn and fading, pinned above his work table. Great change begins with one small motion. He smiled as he traced the words with his eyes. For decades, he had thought it was advice for the future, a way to move forward. But now he saw that it had always been a message about return. Kaizen had guided his hands to grow through small, constant motion. Shoshin had kept his heart young, reminding him that mastery was just another word for curiosity that never died. Together, they had led him here, to the still point where learning and living became the same thing. As the last light faded, he took one of his smallest clocks, a modest wooden piece, plain and unadorned, and wound it carefully. The click of the spring was softer than his own breath. He listened to its first tentative ticks, and a memory rose. The morning decades ago when he had cleaned a single window and seen the world again. He realized that this moment, too, was one small act of beginning. Sora, sensing his master's quiet mood, approached and said softly, "Shall I finish for you?" Hirado shook his head. "No, my hands still remember the way." He smiled, and besides, it would be rude to leave the day unfinished. When the clock began to run true, Hirado set it on the shelf beside all the others. He watched it join their chorus, another voice in the long conversation between past and present. The sound was steady, alive, whole. Later that night, when the shop was dark and still, Sora found Hirado sitting quietly at his table, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and calm. The candle beside him had melted low, but its light held steady. He seemed not asleep, but listening, to the rhythm he had spent a lifetime learning to hear. Outside, the rain began again, gentle and rhythmic, the same as it had been years ago when he taught Sora the meaning of small things. Each drop struck the roof like a memory repeating itself, reminding the town that even in endings, the pattern continues. Sora looked around the workshop, the careful order, the clock hands glinting in the candlelight, and realized that his teacher's greatest creation was not any of these objects. It was this harmony, this discipline of calm presence, this faith in patient, humble progress. He bowed deeply, whispering, "Thank you." And though Hirado did not move, a faint smile lingered on his lips, as if he had heard and understood. The circle had closed, not in completion, but in continuity. The student would rise tomorrow and begin his own day of small motions, and through him the rhythm would live on. Kaizen had never been a system, it was a way of breathing, and Shoshin, the beginner's mind, ensured that the breath would always be new. Outside, the first light of dawn pressed against the horizon, turning the world from darkness to pale gold. Another day had begun, quiet and endless, waiting to be changed by one small motion.
When the sound of the last clock faded into memory, what remained was rhythm, a rhythm that lived quietly inside anyone who had ever paused to listen. The story of Hiroto was never about mastery, but about motion, about the invisible architecture of change that grows through attention rather than ambition. It was a story of how a man reshaped his life not by force, but by faith in the smallest possible steps. The wisdom of Kaizen, continuous improvement, is not ancient magic. It is the most human of sciences. Modern psychology calls it behavioral compounding, the gradual layering of microhabits until they alter the foundation of identity. Neuroscience explains that small, consistent acts light up reward circuits in the brain, releasing dopamine not from success, but from progress. Each act of showing up, no matter how small, rewires belief. The mind begins to whisper, "I can." And the whisper, repeated enough, becomes conviction. Shoshin, the beginner's mind, lives in that same circuitry. Curiosity triggers novelty. Novelty keeps the brain adaptable, creative, young. When we believe we already know, the mind closes, turning experience into echo. But when we approach the world with openness, the prefrontal cortex fires differently. The brain interprets uncertainty not as danger, but as possibility. To practice Shoshin is to train the self to see again. It is to walk through familiar rooms and notice what has always been there, the quiet detail, the hidden lesson, the beauty waiting in repetition. Together, Kaizen and Shoshin form a kind of psychological ecosystem. Kaizen gives structure to movement, the discipline to refine 1% at a time. Shoshin keeps the movement alive, the wonder that prevents discipline from hardening into duty. When one forgets curiosity, progress becomes sterile. When one forgets consistency, curiosity evaporates into distraction. But when the two walk together, growth becomes art. The Japanese call this harmony kokoro, heart, mind, and spirit moving as one. It is not the cold precision of a system, it is the warm intelligence of presence. In Hiroto's workshop, that harmony became tangible. The rhythm of tools, the balance of patience and persistence, the stillness between each tick of the clock. The science may speak of neurons and reinforcement loops, but the experience remains spiritual. It is the quiet joy of knowing that the smallest act, done with care, is enough to tilt the soul toward light. Hiroto's journey is a mirror for anyone lost in the weight of self-improvement. So many chase transformation as if it were a prize to be claimed. But the truth, older than any philosophy, is this: growth does not demand a revolution. It asks only for devotion to one honest motion repeated with love. The life that feels stagnant can begin to breathe again with the simplest act: a walk at dawn, a note of gratitude, a small promise kept. It is easy to underestimate these gestures. The modern mind, impatient and restless, craves immediacy. But life, as Hiroto discovered, is not built in leaps. It is carved in increments, in small refinements of attention. The man who changes his life by 1% each day does not wake one morning a different person. He wakes each morning more himself, more aware, more patient, more whole.
When doubt returns, as it always will, remember the science and the soul of this practice. The brain does not need brilliance to change, it needs repetition. The heart does not need perfection to heal, it needs presence. Every small act, every sharpened tool, every clean corner, every morning you rise and try again, sends a message through your nervous system. I am alive and I am moving. And one day, when you pause long enough to look back, you will see what Hiroto saw. The distance between who you were and who you are will not be measured in milestones, but in quiet days that felt ordinary until they were gone. You will find that your life has shifted almost imperceptibly toward grace, that your mind has softened into openness, that your heart, once heavy, now beats with rhythm rather than rush. That is the science of Kaizen. That is the wisdom of Shoshin. The lesson is simple. Begin small. Begin now. If all you can change today is how gently you breathe, how deeply you notice, or how kindly you speak to yourself, let that be enough. Because all greatness begins like this, with one small motion, repeated until it becomes love.